So congratulations on making it to the end of the jQuery section of the Complete Web Developer course. We've gone from introducing jQuery and showing you why you might want to learn a JavaScript framework. Then we recreated a lot of the JavaScript techniques that we'd learned in the previous section in jQuery, and we saw that they were generally shorter, easier to read, and easier to extend and improve in jQuery. Then we moved on and we did some fancy animation and fading with jQuery, which was really easy. We saw how we could use jQuery and Ajax to build an interactive website that didn't require any page refreshes, which is really the most powerful thing that we've learned in this section. Then we learned about regular expressions and we did some form validation. And finally, we looked in detail at jQueryUI.com as an example of a jQuery plugin and how we might use the general skills of looking at documentation and extracting the bits of code that we need to make our websites do what we want them to quickly and easily. So that's jQuery for you. I hope you like it. And now I'm going to give you an opportunity to practice what you've learned by building a project which I call Code Player. Now, if you remember back to the beginning of the course, I talked about how you might want to share the code that you're writing with others, either to get feedback or bug fixes, or to just share a good technique. And one of the websites I showed you was jsbin.com, which is a great way of doing that. And this is more or less what we're going to recreate with our Code Player. So we're going to build a slightly simplified version of this. It's going to have all the core functionality, that is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript panels, which appear and disappear as you click on them. We're going to miss out the console because that just adds unnecessary complexity at this point, I think, and we're going to have the output there on the right as well. So let me show you the final version of what we're going to produce, and then you can have a go at producing it yourself. So you can see the design of my version is pretty similar to JSBin. I've simplified it and I've renamed it to Code Player. But other than that, we've got the core toggle buttons at the top and then the two content frames here as well. And the toggle buttons, of course, work really well. We can switch off HTML, switch off CSS, and also JavaScript. So we've got all four happening at once here. And just like with JSBin, as soon as I change anything here, it's updated immediately in the output window over here. Exactly the same with styles and JavaScript. There we go. So that's basically it. As always, there's a couple of things that we haven't seen before, but they're pretty minor and you should be able to Google to get the answers. So have a go at it. Best of luck. Hope you managed to come up with something pretty close to this. But of course, as always, I'll show you how I solve the problems after the pause. Good luck. All right then. Hope that went well. Here we go. So let's get our basic framework up here. There we are. And then let's clear our file. Let's start with a look at jsbin.com and look at the overall style and layout of the page. We're going to want a bar up the top here with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and output buttons. And then I'd like to have Code Player as a little logo on the left there. And then below that, we want the rest of the screen to be divided into the 4 panes, which we're going to toggle on and off with those buttons. So I'm going to start by creating this top panel here, mostly using CSS. We'll move on to the main area after that. All right, so let's see if I can get that background gray color first off, using my color dropper or color picker that we've seen before. So I want to pick a color from the page and the color looks like 1D, 1D, 1D. Oh, I've copied the wrong color, but I can remember the right one. Okay, so let's have a div with an ID of, let's call it header or top bar or something like that. And then within that, I want to have my logo on the left which is just going to be a simple text code player, but I want that to appear on the left. And then I'm going to want a collection of these divs or buttons. I think I'm going to call them divs, and then that'll be easier to style them exactly how I want. So let's have a div to be our button container, and then within that we'll have our buttons. So I'll give it a class of toggle button, and the first one's going to be HTML, and we'll need IDs for each of these as well, because we'll need to do something when each of them are pressed. So let's have our first one with a class of toggle button ID of HTML. Second one, class of toggle button ID of CSS. Third one, ID of JavaScript. And the fourth one with an ID of output. So in terms of content, that's all I need for my top bar. So let's see how it looks without any styling. Not great. Not to worry though, we can fix that easily enough. So first off, let's add our necessary styles. I'm going to change the body font to just a simple sans serif. Great. And then let's work our way down our HTML elements, applying our styles to them. So our header div, we want to have a width of 100%, a background color of, do you remember what it was? I think it was 1D, 1D, 1D. Let's just have a look. Nope, it definitely wasn't that. So I think we'll need to pull out the whole width to get what we need. There we go. All ease by the looks of it. Okay, that's better. We definitely want to get rid of any padding there. So let's add padding is 0 and margin is 0 to the body. There we go. But I think we can have a bit of padding in the header. So let's start with a padding of 5 pixels. Okay, that's beginning to look nice. And I'm going to leave my logo stylings for the moment because I want to see how much space I've got once I've styled the buttons. So let's style my button container next. And the main thing I want to do is center it and give it a certain width. So let's start with a width of 200 pixels. We'll probably need to increase that a little bit, but we'll see how it goes. And you'll probably remember a margin of 0 auto is what we need to center it. There we go. Obviously it doesn't look centered there, but that's okay because these are just aligned to the left. So the whole thing goes from about there to about there. All right, now let's apply some styles to our toggle buttons. The main thing we're going to want them to do is float left so that they happen one after the other. Great, that reminds me that we'll need to make the logo float left as well. so that everything is in line. And that means we're going to need a height for our header. Let's go for 20 pixels for the moment. We'll probably need to increase that a little bit. Okay, so it's already looking a lot better than what we started with. The main thing we're going to need next is this nice button styling. So let's apply that. First off, we'll have a border of 1px solid grey. Okay, not beautiful yet, but we'll get there. Let's increase our width there to 300 pixels. Let's introduce some padding. So let's try 4 pixels, see how that looks. Okay, not bad. Now you can see that we've got a kind of double border there because we've got the left border and the right borders together. And that's one thing that we don't want. So let's fix that by setting the border right to be none. And that then fixes that problem whilst introducing another problem that we don't have one on the right. But that's okay, we can fix that easy enough. And we're actually going to need some custom stylings for HTML and output anyway, because we want those to have the nice rounded effect. So let's apply that. We'll add a special style for HTML. So we want a border top left radius of, let's try 4 pixels, and a border bottom left radius of 4 pixels as well. Lovely. And then similarly for output, the rightmost div, this time we want a border top right radius of 4 pixels. We want a border bottom right radius of 4 pixels, and we want a border right of 1px solid grey. Beautiful. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. I think I want the text there to be a little bit smaller. So let's try setting the font size to 90%. Yep, I like that. And a little bit more padding. Great. Okay, you can spend a lot longer styling those as you wish, but I think that's good enough. Now that I've got these set up, I can change the width of my button container so it's correctly centered. So let's just experiment a little bit. Let's reduce it to 200 pixels, so that's too small. 230, still too small. 250 is big enough. So we essentially want to make this as small as we can without doubling up any of our rows. And then it will be correctly centered. There we go. So 233 is what we want. Great. So now our buttons look good. Obviously the header bar is not quite as high as I'd like. We could fix that with a width, with a height, I mean. So let's experiment with that. 30 pixels. That looks actually pretty bang on. That'll do. So now let's just change the logo to have a font weight of bold. And let's try a font size of 120%. See how that looks. I think that's fine. We'll then give it a little bit of padding to move it around. So let's try 3 pixels at the top and 5 pixels left and right. I think that looks pretty good. Obviously it's not great styling, but it does the job. Alright, so now we're more or less done with our top bar in terms of its layout and stylings. The next thing I'm going to look at is setting up the jQuery to apply the necessary effects in terms of the hovering and whether each item is selected. So let's set up the hovering first of all. We're going to do that with a bit of jQuery, and we want to apply our jQuery to all the toggle buttons. So we use the dot or period for our class selector, and we want to select toggle button. And you may remember the jQuery command hover, which is perfect for what we want here. And what we want to do is when the user hovers over one of these, we want to turn the background slightly darker. So we want to apply it to the one that the user is hovering over, and we do that using this, as we saw a few videos ago. And we want to set the background color to, let's just try grey, see how that looks. Alright, that hasn't done anything. Not to panic. Let's inspect and see if we've got a problem in our jQuery somewhere. Ah yes, in fact my jQuery is completely wrong, isn't it? I've forgotten to say that we're defining a function here, and then we need to finish off our function down there. Alright, let's try that again. Okay, that's better. So that works really well. One problem obviously that we've got here is that we're making the background color grey, but then we're not changing it back to what it was when the hover stops. That's not something we've seen how to do before, but it would be surprising if there wasn't something built into the jQuery hover function that could cope with that. So I'm just going to Google jQuery hover, and let's have a look at the documentation and see if there's an easy way to deal with that. Aha, so it's looking like we've got a handler in and a handler out. So it is perfect for what we need. Bind two handlers to the matched elements to be executed when the mouse pointer enters and leaves the elements. So let's have a look at that example there. So it looks like all we need to do is add two functions. The first one will happen on the hover, and then the second one will happen when the user stops hovering. So that should be simple enough. So there's our first function. So we want to add the second one right after that. And that's going to do something very similar. So it's just going to take the CSS of this, so that is the element that's been hovered over, and set the background color back to the big string of E's that it was before. Okay, let's have a look. Much better. Great. Finally here, we need to have our buttons go blue when they are selected. And we want to have initially HTML and output selected. So the way I'm going to deal with that is have a class known as, or that I will call active. And we'll apply the active class when the user has selected to view whichever button we're talking about. So initially we want HTML and output to be active, but the others not. So let's decide our stylings. Oops. Actually, all we want is for the background color to be that nice shade of blue. So I'm going to have problems getting that with my color picker because it's going to overwrite it, I suspect. But I think it's the same as this shade of blue here. So I'm just going to use that shade of blue. Let's have a look. So we want to set the background color of anything with an active class to that blue. Wonderful. And finally, I want to make it so that when the user clicks on one of these, it becomes blue, or stops being blue if it was already blue. And I'm actually wondering if there might be a better way to do that. You'll notice that when we remove our hover, we lose the blue, which makes sense because we've set the background color back to the string of ease, which is the light gray. So actually, would it be better to have a class for this, essentially a highlighted class, and then toggle that class on the hover? Let's have a look. So we'll call it highlighted button, and all it is it's going to have a background color of gray, and then when we hover over, we want to add the class of highlighted button. And then when we stop hovering over, we want to remove the class of highlighted button. Now, add class and remove class are not functions that we've seen before, but with a little bit of Googling, you could get there. And then the advantage of this is it adds the class, but then it removes the class. So it retains whatever styling it had before. So that's a better way of doing it than just manually changing the background color. It also does a better job of keeping our styles and our code separate, so we don't have any hard-coded colors in our JavaScript. Great. So then we just need to make it so that when the user clicks, it adds or removes the active class. So that should be pretty straightforward. When the toggle button is clicked, we want to run a function, and this time we want to toggle the blue class. So I'm going to do a quick search for jQuery toggle class, because I think there's probably a way of doing it that makes that easy. Yep, look, we've got a toggle class function there. Let's have a look at an example. So toggle class looks to me like it's just going to add the class if it's not there and remove it if it is there. So that's perfect. So we want to take the element that's been clicked on and we want to toggle the class of active. And this should add the class of active, which will make the background blue if it's not there, and it'll remove it. There we go, if it is there. Brilliant. The only slightly odd behavior there is that when we initially click, we've still got that background color of gray, so we don't see that it's been selected until we remove the mouse pointer. So to get around that, I'm just going to remove the highlighted button class whenever the user clicks on it. So that should give it a quicker bit of feedback. So if I now click there, you can see straight away that that's selected. If I click again, you can see straight away that it's not selected. Great. So now we've got our buttons behaving in the way we want to. Now the real challenge comes. We need to actually make the main content of the page. Let's start off by getting our HTML and output looking right and working correctly. Then we'll add in our CSS and JavaScript. So I'm going to make the HTML a text area and the output a div. So let's make that happen. So underneath the header section, we'll have a div I'll just call it body container. And the first thing that we'll have there is a text area. It will have an ID of HTML text area. And let's give it a little bit of initial content. Hello world. All right, there we go. Very good. Let's next sort out the width and height. The only text areas I have are all going to have the same styles, so we're just going to style it using text area, but you could put a class in there if you prefer. And we want a width of initially 50% and a height of 100%. Let's have a look at that. Now that looks pretty good, but if we scroll down, you can see we've actually got a little bit more text area than we want. And that's because it's setting the height of the text area to the whole height of the page, which is not what we want. So as always, there's a number of ways to fix that. But as we're in a jQuery section, let's figure it out with jQuery. What we really want is the height of this text area to be equal to the height of the user's page minus the height at the top here. So what we don't know how to do there is get the page height. So let's have a quick Google. I'm sure there's a way to do it. Okay, so dot height we're aware of. Aha! Looks like that second one is actually what we want. So window height. So string and then window selects the window. Do we want the window height or the document height though? So looking at those definitions, we want the window height, the height of the user's screen. Okay, so let's set the text area height to be equal to the window height minus the height of the header. So that is header dot height. So we're setting the text area height to be equal to the height of the window minus the height of the header. Let's just have a look, and we'll just get rid of the CSS height command so we can see clearly what's going on. And you may have noticed I've forgotten my parentheses after height there. Okay, that's still a little bit large. I suspect that's down to some padding, so I'm going to subtract. Let's try an extra 10 pixels and see how that looks. Extra 15, that looks just about right. We also don't want this to be resizable. So let's see if there's an easy way to make text areas not resizable. There we go. Again, this is something we haven't done before, so we'll do a quick Google to find out how to do it. There we go. How to disable resizable property of text area. That looks very promising. Let's have a look. Resize is none. Okay, that should do it. So let's have a look. Excellent. So now no longer resizable. Wonderful. So now let's just add in our output. And actually, thinking about it, I think making it an iframe will be a lot easier because we want to be able to process code in this iframe. And that's a lot easier to do in an iframe than a div. So let's have an iframe with an ID of output. And just thinking about it there, I would like to have the same word after each of these. So after HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, so that it's easy when someone clicks on them to find the corresponding element down here. So I think I'm going to change text area there to panel, just so that I can use the same word for all of them when I need to display or hide them later on. Okay, and let's just have a look at that. All right, it's sort of in the right place, but we've got a little bit of work there. So let's have a panel class for each of those. I think the only thing we'll need for all of them is a float left, and actually that width being 50% could be in the panel class as well. Now that makes the iframe disappear completely, or does it? It's actually gone underneath because it's slightly too wide now. And that's because, remember, the width being 50%, a little bit of padding is added on to that. And similarly with the iframe. So the total width here is slightly more than 100%, which is why the iframe goes below the text area. So again, a number of ways to fix that, but I'm going to do it with jQuery, just like we did down here. So this time we're going to take our panel class and apply the width, or we're going to change the width of it to the window width. This time we don't want to get rid of a header, but we do want to divide it by 2. And then we want to subtract a certain number from that, which will be equal to our padding. There we go. So that looks a lot better. Let's just reduce that number as much as we can. I think that looks fine. And similarly, we can actually change the text area there to panel, because we want to change the iframe height as well. So that will then stretch the iframe all the way down to the bottom. The iframe, however, I don't think we need a border on at all. So let's remove that. There we go. And that actually makes me want to remove the border from the HTML at the top there. So let's add a border top none to our text areas. And that's now a bit striking as well. So I'm going to change the border color to grey. Great, I think that's a bit neater. Great. Now we just need to get the HTML to display in our iframe. This is something we haven't done before. So let's try something like iframe change HTML content. This looks good. We've changed the URL before, but we haven't changed the contents. There we go. So it looks like we can take the iframe and then just change the contents like that. They're changing the contents of a specific div, but we're going to change the contents of the whole thing. So let's just copy that code. Initially, let's just run this command when the page loads. I don't want to update a particular div. I want to update the whole HTML of the iframe. So I want to find the HTML tag and replace it with, just for now, my HTML. There we go. Great. So we've changed the code of the iframe, and you can see that we've got none of the same styles as for the rest of the page here, because this is a iframe within it, so it doesn't take on the styles, which is actually ideal for what we want, because then the user can use their own styles. All right. So it's all very well to make it update when the page loads, but we also want it to update when the user updates their content. And of course, we want to update it with their content, not my HTML every time. So first off, let's get the contents of the HTML text area. So that's just HTML panel and then dot val to get the value. So let's just check that that works. Excellent. So it's now updating there. What we'd really like is for this to update immediately as we're typing our code. And for that, we'd need an event to trigger every time the text area was updated. So again, that's something we haven't done before. So let's see if there's a way to do it. jQuery event when text area updated, something like that. How can I bind the change event of a text area in jQuery? Gotta love Stack Overflow. So that top result looks good, but just having a look further down, bind is deprecated, so this looks ideal for us. So it selects a text area and then on certain events happening, then a function will take place. And so they're fairly obvious. We've got change, we've got key up, so that's when the user lifts their fingers off a key or when the user pastes something in. So this should cover every event of our text area changing. So let's add that code in so we can select all of our text areas even though we've only got one, and when that happens we want this to update. Let's have a look. That's pretty awesome. And we could even put some HTML code in here. And it will apply that immediately. So this is pretty powerful, being able to do something as soon as the user changes the contents of a text area, or that would work just as well with an input as well. Great, so we're making pretty good progress. All we've got left to do is to bring in the CSS and JavaScript panels. So let's add them in as text areas. So we want a CSS panel and a JavaScript panel. And we'll have a little bit of demo CSS and JavaScript to get us started. So in our JavaScript, we'll just have alert, hi there. And in our CSS, we'll have some green standard text or paragraph text. Right, and initially we want those to be hidden. So let's have a hidden class which will have a display property of none. So if we have a look at that, they won't display initially. But what we want, of course, is that when we click CSS, that the CSS appears. So we've already got a function that happens when the toggle button is clicked. So what we want to do is show or hide the respective panel when that button is clicked. So there's a few things that we'll need for this. We'll need to get the ID of the panel that we want to show or hide. And to get that, we'll need the ID of the button that was clicked. So to get the ID of the button that was clicked, we use this .attr for attributes and then ID. And then we're going to want to add the word panel onto the end of that. Because remember, we've got HTML panel, CSS panel, etc. Note there's a capital P there. So to keep our code reasonably readable, let's create a variable called panel ID, which is going to be the ID of the panel that we're going to show and hide. And let's just alert it quickly to make sure that we've got the right thing. Yep, that looks good. Okay, so then we can use the jQuery selector to select hash and then panel ID. And we want to toggle the class. And the class we want to toggle is, I forgot what I call it, hidden. There we go. So let's have a look. If we now click HTML, you can see the HTML disappears and then it comes back. Wonderful. Incidentally, there is actually a jQuery function called toggle, which just displays or hides an element. So that's a little bit neater than toggle class in this case, because you don't actually need the class because the command is built into jQuery. Now you might be anticipating a problem we're going to have though. If we try and bring in the CSS panel, then that works great, but what it doesn't do is change our widths. Obviously, if we've got 3 panels, each of which have a width of 50%, that's going to go over the top width allowed on our page. So we're going to need to make the panels narrower the more we have of them. Fortunately, we have some code to do that, and that's this command here. So this changes the panel width. The problem is we're going to have to work out how many panels are being displayed at any one time. Now we could do that with a variable and then keep track of it and add one to it and subtract one to it each time an item is toggled, but I think there's a slightly neater way to do it. And that is if we could find a way in jQuery to count the number of elements with a certain class, that would give us the answer that we needed. So if we make that class hidden and go back from toggle to toggle class, so it was useful after all, then we could count the number that are hidden and subtract that from 4 to get the number that are active. So let's see if we can find a way to do that. jQuery count elements with a certain class. Counting elements by class. That looks good. And there we go. Once again, we see how easy and obvious jQuery is. We just use something like that. So we select the class that we want, and then we look for the length of that variable, and that will tell us the number of items with that class. So let's create another variable called number of active panels, and that's going to be equal to 4, which is our maximum possible, take away the number of inactive panels, which is the panels with the hidden class. And then instead of dividing by 2, we're going to divide by the number of active panels. So that should divide by 2 initially, and then 3 if we have 3, 4 if we have all 4. Let's take a look. Excellent. So now it's dividing it into 3 panels, add in JavaScript, and we get all 4. Fabulous. I hope you followed that bit. There was some quite complicated code there. Feel free to rewind the video and just watch that bit again if it was a little bit unclear. Okay, we can now see that we've got some slight issues with our borders there. So I'm just going to change panels to have a left border of none. Let's just have a look. Great, that looks a lot better. And there's also one issue that you might have imagined, that if we get rid of them all, then we're dividing by 4 take away 4, which is 0. Fortunately, this doesn't cause us a major problem because it means the JavaScript won't do anything here, but we don't need it to resize the width anyway because we've hidden everything. So actually it doesn't really matter, and we can just bring them back in the same way as before. All right, so we're pretty close now. What we need to do is to get our styles and JavaScript to happen in this iframe here. So let's head on down to where we would want that to happen. So at the moment, we're just putting in the contents of the HTML text area. So this is going to be a little bit messy, but it'll get the job done. What I'm going to do is manually put in our HTML page to insert our styles and our JavaScript. So I'm going to start with HTML and then head. We don't need a title because we're not displaying that anyway, but we do need some styles. So I'm going to have style and then type equals, and I'm going to use single quotes because I'm using double quotes for this whole string. And the type is text/CSS. And then I'm going to put in our CSS, which is the contents of the CSS panel. So it's CSS panel val. And then I'm going to end my styles. I'm going to end my head. I'm going to start my body. Then I'm going to have my HTML. And I'm going to leave the JavaScript for the moment for reasons that we'll see in a couple of minutes. But for now that I've got my body content, I'm going to close the body and close the HTML. So this should essentially create an inline HTML page with this content. So starting with HTML, then head, then it should put in all the styles that we've got in our CSS text area here. Then it closes the styles, closes the head, starts the body, puts the HTML panel content in, and then closes the body and closes HTML. So it will create a kind of full HTML page with the content and styling there. Let's not forget the close parenthesis there. And now we should find then that the HTML of the contents of our iframe should be updated to a full HTML file, essentially, with HTML and then a header with the style and then the styles of the CSS panel inserted there. Close the style, close the head, and start the body. Then put the HTML panel contents in there, and then close the body, close the HTML. So just to check that that is happening, let's update the HTML panel contents to contain a paragraph tag. Otherwise, the styles won't be applied to them. There we go. And now let's have a look. So we should now find when we update this, there we go. Now the styles are being applied as well as the content. Great. We want that, of course, to happen on page load as well. So one solution to do that would be to copy our iframe code and replace the update that we had at the beginning with that. But as we've seen, we don't like having two chunks of code that are exactly the same. So what I'm going to do is create a function called update output. Pretty straightforward, and that will just do the updating. And then we can call that both at the start of the page, when the page is loaded, and when we have any updates. So now when we run, we should find, yep, we get the styles applied as well on the initial setup. So now all that remains is our JavaScript. And this, as you might have gathered, is going to be slightly more complicated than applying the CSS. So what we can't do is just add a script tag here. You can feel free to try it, and it might even work in some browsers, but it definitely doesn't work in the version of Chrome that I'm working with here. And that's primarily for security reasons. Running JavaScript within an iframe is not considered ideal. And in fact, if you were making this site live and allowing people to actually use it, you'd want to be very careful about what JavaScript they were allowed to run here, because there are potentially ways to start running code on your server through a site like this. If you did have a project that did something like that and you wanted to do it securely, there's plenty of help out there. Google something like run JavaScript in iframe securely or something like that. The main thing is to bear in mind that executing JavaScript that your users can edit in an iframe on your server is a little bit risky, and you should take some security precautions. All right, so first off, how do we execute this JavaScript at all? What if we just wanted to run some random JavaScript that the user has entered? This is something that we haven't done before. So let's try searching for something like run a JavaScript string. Something like that, because essentially what we've got is a string and we want to run it as JavaScript. Okay, that eval function looks like it does what we need. Okay, fantastic. So eval just evaluates a string of JavaScript. Fabulous. That looks like it could be very useful for us. So let's try adding that to our update output function. So we'll just eval, and the thing we want to eval is the contents of the JavaScript panel. So let's get those. So we'll select the JavaScript panel and get the value. All right. And that actually did nothing. Why is that? Ah, yes. You can see, you may have spotted my deliberate mistake there. I forgot to close the double quotes on my JavaScript alert function. So let's try that again. There we go. Right, so we're running our JavaScript, which is great, but we're not quite done yet because we're running the JavaScript on the original site at the moment, and we want to run it in the iframe. Now, with something like an alert, that doesn't make any difference. But if the user actually wanted to update or do something with the contents of their iframe, then that wouldn't work here because we're running the JavaScript in the original page, not within the iframe. So we need to run the JavaScript code on the iframe itself. Again, that's something that we haven't done before. So let's see if we can figure out how to do it. I think we're going to be using the eval command. So let's try eval JavaScript within iframe. Something like that. Okay, that first one looks pretty promising. Any way of getting JavaScript injected into an iframe without removing and reappending it? That is indeed what we want to do. Okay, so this is looking promising. We can take the iframe and look at the content window. So looking at that, we can get the iframe. We can already do that. We then get the iframe's content window, which is iWind in this example, and then we apply the evaluate function to that. Okay, that looks like just what we want to do. So let's do it using good old-fashioned JavaScript. Our iframe has an ID of output panel. So we can use our old friend get element by ID and then a hash and output panel. And then looking over here, we want to use content window to access the content window. That's the contents of the iframe itself. And then we want to eval our code. So in fact, we can just copy this. And that will do essentially the same as what we had before, but it will evaluate the code within the iframe itself, not on the initial page. And just before we run that, you might have noticed I've made a mistake there, confusing my jQuery and JavaScript, which is very easily done, with JavaScript here. Because we're getting an element by ID, we don't need to put the hash in, we just put the ID itself in. All right, let's take a look. Hurrah! So our JavaScript is being run Would be good to have confirmation that it is indeed being run inside the iframe though. So let's just quickly do that. We could give our paragraph here an ID of paragraph, and then we could edit our JavaScript code so that it just changed the contents of the paragraph instead of alerting something. And then if that works, we know that our JavaScript is being executed inside the iframe. So let's do that. We want document.get elements by ID. The ID here is paragraph. And then we want to change the inner HTML to, let's use my classic alternative, hello Rob. All right, if I've got that correct, then it should update when I refresh. It does indeed. Fantastic. So that's it. We've achieved our objective. We have a really quite nice looking site, pretty simple, but it looks good. We can toggle the HTML, CSS, JavaScript and output on and off as we want. And then as soon as we update any of these, the updates are immediately reflected in the output there. Brilliant. So there's our code player. As always, I hope you managed to do most of that yourself and enjoyed the process of putting it together. This brings us to the end of the jQuery section. So once again, give yourself a pat on the back, but brace yourself because we're soon going to find out how to make great looking responsive websites. That is, ones that respond immediately to the user's screen size and display a different layout depending on whether they're on their phone or their tablet or their computer. We're going to do that using a completely free framework called Bootstrap, and that's all coming in the next section. I'll see you there.